In the heart of Silicon Valley, where gods of code and capital cast long shadows, there stands a monument to human ambition, a tower of glass and steel that seems to pull the sky down to earth. This is the headquarters of OmniTech. Inside, the air itself feels different, filtered, controlled, and humming with an intelligence that is almost electric. This is not a building, it is a cathedral dedicated to logic, a place where thousands of the brightest minds on the planet have been gathered to solve the unsolvable, to turn equations into existence. They do not merely build the future, they will it into being. But on this day, the cathedral was silent. The ivory tower of the future was shrouded in a fog of its own creation. Deep within its core, in the executive war room, the silence was a physical weight. The room was a study in cold precision, brushed aluminum, obsidian black tables, and smart glass that looked out onto a digital abyss. At the head of that table sat Dr. Julian Vance, the Chief Technology Officer. Vance was a man forged in certainty. His mind was a fortress of algorithms and data, and he viewed failure not as a setback, but as a personal insult. His gaze was fixed on a massive holographic display where a single glowing red line on a Gantt chart represented a failure costing millions of dollars every hour. Before him stood Ben Carter. Ben was the prodigy, the golden boy from MIT, the lead engineer on a project that was supposed to redefine the industry. Today, he was just a man drowning in his own brilliance. Dr. Vance, his patience worn to a microscopic thread, gestured with a single sharp motion. He wanted the report again. Ben tried to speak, his voice catching in the sterile air. He recounted the facts, each one a nail in his own coffin. 782 failed simulations. They had replaced the entire batch of next-generation Iris-X optical sensors. They had rewritten the control code, analyzed the atomic structure of the solder, and measured the vibration of the earth beneath the building. The problem, he explained, remained. It was a ghost, a micro-deviation. In approximately 0.001% of their flagship units, at the final high-temperature micro-soldering phase, a thermal fluctuation occurred. A flicker of heat so small, so fast, it was technically immeasurable by their own world-class standard metrics. It was a problem that, according to their own data, shouldn't exist. And yet, it was enough. Enough to create a structural flaw that would cascade into total failure after exactly 1,000 hours of operation. It was a perfect, invisible, catastrophic error. Vance's fist struck the obsidian table. The sound was not loud, but it was absolute. His fury was cold. He posed the question to the entire room, a room filled with PhDs in materials science, quantum physics, and robotics. How? How had they, the architects of the modern world, been defeated by a problem they couldn't even see? They were the men and women who controlled variables down to the last atom. They had all the data. They had all the knowledge. And they had absolutely no answers. They offered theories, their voices hesitant. Atmospheric pressure, solar flares, quantum tunneling. Each theory was shot down. They were trapped in their own complexity. So high up in their ivory tower that they could no longer see the ground. Vance stood. His shadow fell across the table. He did not yell. He simply pronounced judgment. He gave them 48 hours. It was not a deadline. It was an ultimatum. Ben Carter, the golden boy, left the war room a broken man. He felt the crushing weight of 1,000 brilliant minds failing, his own chief among them. He descended, not in the elevator back to his gleaming office, but down, past the R&D labs, past the yoga studios and wellness centers, down to the production floor. The floor was a different world. It was a silent, automated ballet. Robotic arms, each costing more than a house, moved with hypnotic, inhuman grace. The air was scrubbed. The light was a perfect, shadowless white. It was another kind of church, one dedicated to absolute, soulless precision. And it was here, amidst this flawless choreography, that Ben almost collided with a man who was not supposed to exist in this new world. His name was Sam. To the engineers and data scientists of OmniTech, Sam was invisible. He was a function, not a person, an analog ghost in their digital machine. He was the janitor, an old man, small and weathered, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold a quiet, patient sadness. He moved through the high-tech cathedral with a simple, battered janitorial cart. And this cart had a flaw. One of its wheels was old, and it produced a sound. A soft, rhythmic, aching sound. Squeak. Pause. Squeak. Pause. It was the only imperfect thing in the room. A persistent, analog reminder of a world that OmniTech had tried so hard to erase. Ben, lost in his own fog of failure, stumbled, his gaze fixed on the floor. He barely avoided the cart. He looked up, annoyed, and saw Sam for the first time. The man's absolute, unhurried calm felt like a personal affront. In a moment of pure, bitter frustration, Ben let his sarcasm spill out. He gestured at the billion-dollar assembly line, and he asked the janitor if he'd seen any ghosts. Sam didn't look at Ben. He didn't smile. He slowly, methodically, dipped his mop into the bucket, wrung it out, and continued his work. He just looked at the massive, million-dollar robotic welder. He nodded, as if to himself. He said that he, too, was looking for a ghost. Ben stared, confused. Sam continued, his voice a low rumble, barely audible over the hum of the air scrubbers. He said he liked to listen to the machines. And this machine, its sound had changed. Ben's frustration returned. He explained, with the exhausted patience of a professor, that they had high-spec vibration microphones on the servos. The harmonics were flat. The machine was, by every metric, perfect. Sam shook his head just once, a tiny slow motion. He wasn't talking about the motor, he explained. He was talking about the hiss. The hiss, he said, of the inert gas. The puff of argon, right before the weld. It was supposed to be a clean, sharp sound. But sometimes, just sometimes, it sounded choked. A choked hiss. This was madness. Ben was the lead engineer at the most advanced technology company on Earth. And he was standing here with less than 47 hours on the clock, discussing the feelings of a machine with a janitor. He dismissed the old man with a curt nod and walked away, back to his world of data and logic, leaving Sam alone with the sound of his squeaking cart. For the next 36 hours, Ben and his team descended into a special kind of hell. They lived in the control room, a graveyard of coffee cups and shattered theories. They tore the robot apart and rebuilt it. They simulated the code on a quantum server, and they found nothing. It was now 4 o'clock in the morning. The deadline was dawn. The team was broken, asleep on keyboards and conference tables. Ben was alone, staring at the high-speed camera footage of the weld, watching it for the 1,000th, the 10,000th time. Weld, pass, weld, pass, weld, fail. He saw nothing. He closed his eyes. The image of the welding tip burned onto his retinas. In the ringing silence of his own failure, a sound returned to him. Squeak, pause. Squeak, pause. And then the old man's words. It sounds choked. His eyes snapped open. It was the last, most desperate act of a drowning man. He opened a different set of logs, not the thermal data, not the vibration analysis. He opened the ambient audio files. He found the timestamp of the last failure. He put on his headphones, filtering out the low-frequency hum of the factory. He cranked the volume, and he just listened. He heard the clean sss of the argon gas. Weld.
swelled, swelled. And then he heard it. It wasn't a choke. It was a flicker, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift in the audio frequency. Fizz, a sound of turbulence. A split second later, the thermal sensors spiked. The failure occurred. Ben's blood ran cold. He was right. Sam was right. The hiss did change. But why? His mind, now unlocked from its cage of data, raced. He pulled up the building schematics. The audio file gave him a clue. It was a hiss being hit by something. A stray wind, but the clean room's airflow was perfectly laminar. He looked at the schematic. The number 4 robot. What was near it? He traced the lines. 20 yards away, on the other side of a sealed partition, was a massive industrial cooling unit. He checked the cooler's operating logs. He cross-referenced the timestamps. And his heart stopped. At 10 a.m. and 3 p.m., the exact times the R&D department ran its heaviest simulations. The central servers would heat up, and the cooling unit would kick into its peak cycle. It would purge a blast of humid air. The system was designed to vent it up, but there, in the blueprints, was a tiny, overlooked flaw, a shared utility conduit. A small portion of that hot, damp air was being pushed sideways, creating a tiny, random, invisible puff of humidity, blowing directly into the path of the perfectly pure argon gas, fractions of a second before the weld. It was creating a thermal reaction, a micro-deviation. It wasn't a ghost, it was a cloud, a simple, physical, imperfect cloud. The boardroom at 8 a.m. was a tomb. Dr. Vance sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of granite. He was preparing to announce the failure. Ben Carter walked in. He was pale, unshaven, and exhausted. But for the first time in a week, his hands were steady. He did not apologize. He did not make excuses. He simply laid out the truth. He played the audio file. He showed them the blueprints. He told them about the humidity. The room was silent. The assembled geniuses, the architects of the future, were embarrassed. They had been searching for a complex quantum-level problem. The answer was plumbing. Vance stared, not at the data, but at Ben. His mind was already calculating the cost of the fix versus the cost of the failure. But one question remained. He asked Ben how. How, after all their models had failed, had he found it? This was Ben's moment. He could take the credit. He could be the hero who saw the truth. He could be the man who saved OmniTech. Instead, he looked toward the door, and he asked for Sam to be brought in. A moment later, the old man entered, pushing his cart. The squeak of the wheel sounded like a thunderclap in the $1,000,000 silence. Sam looked confused, out of place. A black and white photo in a high-definition world. Vance looked from Ben to the janitor, his confusion turning to a cold, rising anger. He did not understand. Ben explained, his voice clear and calm, that this was the man who had found the flaw. He was the one who listened. The absurdity of the situation broke the tension. One of the engineers snickered. Vance, convinced his lead engineer had finally cracked under the pressure, fixed Sam with a look of pure condescension. He asked the old man, his voice dripping with irony, why, if he was so smart, he was emptying their trash instead of running their laps. It was a cruel question, a question designed to put the world back in its proper order. Sam stood there for a long moment. He looked at the floor. He looked at his cart. Then he looked up, and his eyes met Dr. Vance's, and the janitor disappeared. The small, stooped man stood up straight. The weariness fell away from his eyes, replaced by a profound, ancient dignity. His gaze was no longer quiet. It was sharp. When he spoke, the narrator tells us, his voice was not the voice of a janitor. It was the voice of a man who had built worlds. His name, he said, was Samuel Kowalski. A shockwave hit the room.
Zenith Dynamics. Everyone knew the name. OmniTech's greatest rival, a company that had dominated the industry 20 years ago, before it mysteriously collapsed. Sam told them his story. He had been the chief production design engineer at Zenith. They had faced this exact same problem, 2005, a ghost, a microthermal flaw. It had taken him 3 months to find it, the humidity from a coolant pipe. He told them how he had proposed a simple physical fix, a baffle, a piece of sheet metal to reroute the air.
And he told them how the board, young, data-driven, obsessed with elegant software patches, had rejected his solution. They had called it crude. They had tried to code their way around a problem of physics. They failed. The company folded, and Samuel Kowalski was retired, labeled obsolete, a man who had failed to adapt. He looked around the room at the stunned, young, brilliant faces. He explained that he came to OmniTech because he needed a job, but that he stayed because he couldn't stop being an engineer. He couldn't stop listening. He told them their models were perfect. Their tower was perfect. But the world, he explained, was not. The real world was crude and flawed and physical. He had heard their machine, and it was singing the same sad song he had heard at Zenith. He just figured someone ought to know. He nodded, a formal, final gesture. He turned and began to push his cart toward the door. He said he had to go. The air conditioning unit in the server room had been making a strange sound all morning. He left. The only sound in the boardroom was the fading squeak, pause, squeak. It was the sound of humility. It was the sound of wisdom. In the silence, the ivory tower had been shattered. Dr. Vance, the high priest of data, was humbled. He looked at Ben. His voice, when he finally spoke, was hoarse. He gave a new order. Get him back. Not as a janitor. As the chief production engineer for the entire Iris X line. Ben found him, an hour later, in the basement, in the massive generator room. Sam wasn't cleaning. He was just standing, his head tilted, listening. Ben held out the new contract. Sam looked at it, then at Ben. And a rare small smile touched his lips. He just had one question. He wanted to know if he'd have to learn all that new, complex software. Ben smiled back. He said they would get him all the help he needed. But first, he asked Sam why he was down here. Had he heard something? Sam nodded, tapping the side of the massive generator. It was nothing big, he said, just the fuel pump. It sounded a little tight, and he reminded Ben that if this generator ever died, their whole perfect billion-dollar line would stop anyway. The story of OmniTech is a reminder. That knowledge is proud. It lives in data, in degrees, and in gleaming towers of glass. But wisdom is humble. It's found in experience. It's found in failure. And it's found in the quiet, patient observation of the world as it is. Sometimes, the greatest truths aren't found in the complex equations. They're found in the squeak of a wheel or the hiss of a machine. If only we have the humility to stop and listen.